A forbidden feeling is born between the serf worker Samuel and the owner's daughter Elizabeth, which can reveal an old family secret and change their destinies forever. Spring was slowly arriving on the lands of the Whitmore plantation in the southern United States. The morning air was fresh and cool, and a light mist still drifted over the wide river flowing nearby. With the first rays of sunlight, the vast cotton fields began to gradually come to life. White blossoms swayed in the gentle wind like an endless pale sea stretching far toward the horizon. Above these fields stood a large white house. It rested on a hill as if watching over all the land around it. Its wide columns, tall windows, and long veranda could be seen from almost anywhere on the plantation. From below, the house appeared almost majestic, a symbol of authority and order that had existed here for many years. If one were to look at all of this from the outside, it would seem that life here moved calmly and unchanged. The fields produced their harvest, the workers did their labor, and the owners lived in the shade of the great house. Everything appeared familiar and predictable. But sometimes the greatest secrets are born precisely in places where everything seems peaceful. Down below, among the long rows of cotton, the workers had already begun their day. They moved slowly between the bushes, gathering the soft white clusters into large sacks slung over their shoulders. The quiet rustle of plants could be heard, along with muted conversations and the occasional sound of footsteps on the dry ground. Among these people, one man stood out in particular. His name was Samuel. He was a tall and strong young man with broad shoulders and a calm, attentive gaze. His movements were confident and precise, as if any task came to him without much effort. Samuel almost never spoke unless it was necessary. He worked silently and with focus, not distracting himself with conversation, and often finished his work faster than many of the others. Sometimes the other workers exchanged glances when he passed by. They had long noticed that Samuel was different from them. And it was not only because of his strength or height. There was a quiet dignity in his movements. He carried himself straight and calmly, as if he possessed an inner confidence that was difficult to explain with words. Even when he simply walked across the field, it seemed as though he carried within him some secret about his origin. But Samuel himself never thought about it. His life passed among the fields, the wind, and long working days. Meanwhile, high above the fields, in the large house on the hill, a very different morning was unfolding. On the second floor, by a large window, stood a young woman. Her name was Elizabeth Whitmore. She was the daughter of the plantation owner, the only child in the family. From early childhood she had lived in this house, surrounded by comfort, beautiful furniture, books, and the attention of servants. In her room stood bookcases, musical instruments, and everything that could make the life of a young lady easy and peaceful. But that morning she stood by the window holding a book she was barely reading. Her eyes were directed far below, to where the fields began. She was watching the workers. Her gaze slowly moved across the moving figures until it stopped on one man. On Samuel. He moved among the rows of cotton calmly and confidently, and even from the distance his figure stood out from the others. Elizabeth herself could not explain why she noticed him every time. The incident in the garden. The old garden behind the large Whitmore house was rarely visited by servants or guests. There were old apple trees, the branches of which bent almost to the ground, and a narrow path between the tall grass led to a small pond. In spring, the garden looked especially quiet and a little forgotten, as if time passed more slowly here than in other places. That day, Elizabeth decided to go out for a walk alone. After the morning rain, the air was fresh, and the light scent of wet earth mixed with the scent of young leaves. She walked slowly, holding her hat in her hand so that it would not be blown away by the wind, and listened to the birds singing somewhere far away. Sometimes she came here just to be quiet, away from the big house and its endless rules. The ground was soft and wet after the rain, and the path became slippery in places. Elizabeth did not notice a small stone hidden in the grass. Taking another step, she suddenly stumbled. At the same moment, a sharp pain shot through her leg. The girl lost her balance and fell right onto the wet grass. She sat motionless for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had happened. Then she carefully tried to get up. But as soon as she leaned on her leg, the pain flared up again so much that she had to lower herself to the ground again. Elizabeth sighed softly, feeling both annoyed and embarrassed. The house was quite far away, and there was no one to call for help. She was already beginning to think how she could crawl at least to the path when she suddenly heard a slight rustle between the trees. Someone was approaching. A few moments later, Samuel appeared between the old trunks. He was returning from the far field and walking along the path leading to the stables. When he saw the girl on the ground, he stopped abruptly, as if he couldn't believe his eyes right away. He stood motionless for a few seconds, then cautiously took a step closer. "Miss Elizabeth," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. Elizabeth raised her head. Despite the pain, a slight smile appeared on her face. "It seems I lost this walk today," she said, trying to make a joke. Samuel quickly realized what had happened. He looked at her leg and immediately noticed that she couldn't lean on it. There was concern in his eyes. There was silence between them for a few seconds. The wind gently stirred the branches of the trees, and an apple fell somewhere in the garden. Elizabeth looked at him a little more seriously, as if gathering her thoughts. "Samuel," she said softly, "could you help me get home?" He didn't hesitate for long. Samuel nodded curtly. "Of course, miss." He came closer and bent down carefully. Then he gently lifted her into his arms, trying not to hurt her. Elizabeth was light, and he could smell the faint scent of lavender from her dress. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief moment there was something strange and new that had never happened between them before. But Samuel quickly averted his eyes and turned towards the house, starting to walk slowly along the garden path. Ladder. When Samuel approached the big house, holding Elizabeth in his arms, the morning courtyard seemed unusually quiet. A huge building towered over them, its white columns casting long shadows on the wide steps of the porch. Samuel usually tried not to approach the front door unless absolutely necessary, but now he had no choice. He climbed the steps and carefully opened the door with his shoulder. Inside, the house greeted them with coolness and subdued light. High ceilings, long corridors, and a wide staircase leading to the second floor created a sense of grandeur and strict order. Several servants who were doing their morning chores suddenly stopped when they saw this scene. Their movements froze, as if time had stopped for a moment. No one expected to see a young worker carrying the daughter of the owner of the house in his arms. This sight seemed almost impossible. One of the servants quietly placed a tray on the table, the other maid mechanically wiped her hands on her apron, without taking her eyes off the stairs. A barely audible whisper passed between them. People exchanged glances, but no one dared to say anything louder. Samuel tried not to look around. His footsteps sounded hollow and cautious on the wooden floor. He went to the stairs and started climbing, holding Elizabeth as carefully as if she were something very fragile. The stairs seemed longer than usual. With every step, the silence in the house deepened. Elizabeth felt slightly embarrassed by the looks that followed them from below, but at the same time there was something strangely calm about this situation. She held onto Samuel's shoulder to keep her balance, and felt how confidently and carefully he was climbing the stairs. When they reached the second floor, Samuel headed down the hallway to her room. The door was slightly ajar. He gently pushed it with his foot and went inside. The room was bright and spacious. Sunlight streamed in through the large windows, illuminating the white curtains and neatly arranged furniture. Samuel carefully approached the bed and slowly lowered Elizabeth onto the edge of the soft mattress. After that, he immediately took a step back, as if remembering his place. "I'll get one of the servants, miss," he said softly, preparing to leave. But before he could turn to the door, she stopped him. "Wait, stay for a minute." Samuel froze in place. He hadn't expected those words. For a few seconds, there was silence in the room, broken only by the soft sound of the wind outside the window. Samuel slowly turned back around, not quite sure what to do next. Elizabeth looked at him with a calm, attentive gaze, as if she had really seen him for the first time. Then she asked a simple question. "Have you been working here long?" Samuel lowered his head slightly. "Almost all my life." There was another pause, but it didn't seem awkward anymore. Elizabeth smiled a little. She asked him about the weather, how the work in the fields was going, and about the river, which often floods in the spring beyond the distant meadow. Samuel answered briefly but honestly. Gradually, the conversation became easier. They talked about the wind that comes from the river in the evenings, the hot sun in summer, and the long harvest days. The words were spoken softly and cautiously, as if they both understood that this conversation in itself was already unusual. But the longer they talked, the less the familiar distance between them felt. At some point, they stopped talking like a hostess and a worker. In this quiet room, they suddenly saw each other differently, just like two people who happened to be next to each other at a strange and unexpected moment. Forbidden meetings. After the day when Samuel brought Elizabeth into the house and their conversation in her room unexpectedly dragged on, life on the plantation continued to go on as usual. The workers went out into the fields at first light, the servants went about their business in the big house, and the master rarely appeared in plain sight, preoccupied with household matters. But in the midst of all this familiar life, something barely noticeable appeared, which gradually began to change the silence around. Sometimes, early in the morning, Elizabeth would go out into the garden on the pretext of a walk. She walked along the familiar paths between the trees, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves, but her gaze almost always involuntarily turned to the far courtyard, where the stables were located. Samuel often worked there. He repaired fences, carried buckets of water, or helped with horses. From the outside, everything looked like a normal job, but sometimes he looked up and noticed her among the trees. At such moments, their gazes met for only a few seconds. They didn't say anything, but there were more words in that brief glance than could be said out loud. Sometimes fate seemed to arrange their meetings by itself. One day, Elizabeth was walking along the path near the stable, and Samuel was there, repairing an old wooden fence. He stopped when he noticed her and nodded slightly, as was customary. She stopped too, as if debating whether to continue on her way. "Good morning, Samuel," she said softly. "Good morning, miss," he replied. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes. They talked about the weather, how spring had come earlier than usual this year, and how the river had started to rise again after the rains. But even in these simple words, there was a sense of caution, as if each of them understood that this conversation should not last too long. Another day they met at an old well near the garden. Elizabeth was filling a small bucket with water when Samuel passed by. He offered to help, and she agreed. Their fingers touched for a moment as he handed her the bucket, and both immediately looked away. Such short meetings began to happen more and more often. Sometimes it was just a few words, sometimes it was just a quiet greeting. But it gradually became clear that this was no longer an accident. They started looking for these moments. Sometimes Elizabeth would go out into the garden on purpose at those hours when she knew that Samuel was working nearby. Sometimes Samuel stayed at the stable longer than usual, as if waiting for her to pass by. However, along with this, another feeling grew: anxiety. They both knew how dangerous even the simplest conversation between them could be. This world was built on strict rules that no one dared to break. One evening, when the sun was already sinking behind the distant fields, they met by chance by an old willow tree near the river. Everything was quiet, and the water flowed slowly, reflecting the golden light of the sunset. They stood in silence for several minutes. Then Samuel said softly, without looking at her, "This world won't let us be around." His voice sounded calm, but there was a weight of truth in it. Elizabeth looked at him carefully. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet determination. "Sometimes the world makes mistakes," she replied. And at that moment, they both realized that there was already a feeling between them that couldn't just be forgotten. The secret of the old house. Over time, Elizabeth's father began to notice changes that had previously escaped his attention. At first, it was just small things: her daughter's too long glances towards the fields, her frequent walks in the garden, and the strange silence into which she immersed herself while standing at the second-floor window. But one evening, when he went out onto the veranda of a large house, his gaze accidentally stopped in the courtyard by the stable. Samuel worked there. At the same moment, Elizabeth was standing at the railing and looking down. She thought that no one was watching her, but her father noticed that look: attentive, long, too focused. At that moment, anxiety appeared in his soul. Since then, he has been watching more closely. He noticed how Samuel sometimes walked through the courtyard at the hours when Elizabeth went out into the garden, how they happened to be next to each other, although both tried to behave cautiously. All this was not an open violation of the rules, but the experienced gaze of the owner understood more than others could notice. He didn't say anything for several days, but one night he ordered Samuel to be called into the house. When the young man entered the large office, lit only by a lamp on the table, there was a heavy silence in the room. The owner was sitting in an armchair, his face remained serious and almost motionless. Samuel stopped at the door, waiting for the order. The conversation began slowly and tensely. The owner asked short questions about work, about the field, about the affairs of the stable. Samuel answered calmly and honestly, although he felt that this conversation was leading somewhere further. Finally, the owner looked at him for a long time, as if trying to discern something long forgotten in his face. Then he said an unexpected thing. He began to tell a story that almost no one on the plantation remembered anymore. Many years ago, a young woman worked in this house. She was quiet and hardworking, and her name was Layla. One day, she suddenly disappeared. No one knew exactly what had happened to her, and eventually people stopped talking about it. But soon after her disappearance, a little boy was brought to the plantation. He was too young to remember his past. That boy was Samuel. The owner spoke slowly, as if every word was difficult for him. According to him, many years ago there was a suspicion that the child could be connected with the Whitmore family much more strongly than anyone had imagined. Perhaps the same blood flows in his blood as in the veins of the owners of this house. When Samuel heard these words, he could not utter a sound for a long time. The thought that his life could be connected with this family in a completely different way than he had thought all his life shocked him to the depths of his soul. Elizabeth finds out about this unexpectedly, almost by accident, but after hearing it, everything around her begins to seem different. Those events that used to look like a simple coincidence now take on a new meaning, and every little thing seems to add up to a single picture. Now things are getting even more complicated, because the truth is never simple. It is difficult, sometimes frightening, and always forces a person to make a choice. If this is really true, if everything said is not a mistake or a delusion, then their destinies are intertwined much deeper than they could ever have imagined. This is no longer just an acquaintance, not a chance meeting, and not a short story of two people who once crossed paths on the road of life. It's something more that goes back in time and stretches far ahead, to a place where there are still no answers. But it doesn't change anything for Elizabeth anyway. She thinks about it for a long time, trying to figure out how she should feel, but all that remains inside her is calm confidence. Some things don't require proof because the heart has already decided everything. In the evening, they meet at an old willow tree by the river, as they used to do when the world seemed simpler and clearer. The wind gently stirs the long branches of the tree, and the water flows slowly by, as if oblivious to human doubts and worries. Elizabeth looks at Samuel and realizes that she no longer wants to hide behind words or fear. She takes a step closer and quietly says that she does not want to live as if they are strangers, as if there is nothing between them and never was. She was tired of pretending that everything could be forgotten. Samuel is silent and stares at the river for a long time, as if searching for an answer in its dark depths. He understands that her words are true, but he also knows that the path they may choose will not be easy. A night storm is playing out over empty fields, tree branches are scratching the sky, and rain is hitting the ground with cold drops, as if nature itself decides to test people's strength. The wind carries with it the smell of wet earth and something far away, almost forgotten, and in its howl there are echoes of unsolved mysteries. Samuel stands by the river, motionless, like a part of this landscape, his eyes focused on the dark water that rushes past, ignoring human worries and doubts. He feels the approach of change, feels like every gust of wind reminds him of the inevitability of choice. Elizabeth appears through the thick fog, slowly dissolving the night gloom, with a small suitcase in her hand. She went through an internal struggle, through long nights of doubt and fear, and now her decision is obvious. She chose, and this action reflects all her courage and readiness for a new life. Her eyes reflect the light of the moon breaking through heavy clouds, and this light seems to symbolize the hope that appears even in the darkest circumstances. They look at each other, and the silence between them is filled with meanings that cannot be expressed in words. Every gesture, every look, every sigh conveys emotions that used to be hidden behind fear and uncertainty. There is an unknown ahead, a path where there are no maps and pointers, where every step can lead to joy or to new challenges, but for the first time in their lives they feel freedom, real freedom, the one that cannot be bought or taken away. The camera slowly rises up, capturing a dark landscape in which two silhouettes move along the river, merging with the shadows of the night, going into darkness, but not into oblivion, but into a new stage of their lives. An off-screen voice, soft and deep, like a whisper interrupting the silence of the night, utters words that seem simple, but are fraught with great power. Sometimes love begins with the simplest request, and these words find a response in the hearts of both, because it is in this simple moment that a whole world of feelings, promises, and hopes is hidden. "Samuel, could you help me?" These words, spoken by Elizabeth, sound like a bridge between the past and the future, between fear and courage, between loneliness and traveling together. The wind continues to fan the darkness, the rain plays on the leaves and water, but now they are not afraid of the night, they are not afraid of the storm, because they are together, and in this joint movement towards the unknown there is a force capable of overcoming any obstacles. Every step along the river, every glance at each other, every sound of the night becomes part of a new story, a story where a decision made in courage and love turns into the first step towards freedom, to a real feeling that knows no boundaries. The night is full of whispers, mists, and reflections, but in these reflections you can see not fear, but the path they choose together, step by step, into the darkness and at the same time to the light, into a world where their destinies are intertwined forever, and where a simple request becomes the beginning of something great and real.